"Put the child down," Jace ordered, his voice a lethal, vibrating whisper that froze the entire room. Madeline clutched the baby tighter to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The broken glass from the dropped tray crunched beneath her worn sneakers. She was just a waitress, an invisible ghost in his dark, violent world. But right now, the ruthless boss of the city's most feared syndicate wasn't looking at her trembling hands or her tear-streaked face. He was staring down into the bundle in her arms. The baby blinked, looking up with startling, piercing silver eyes flecked with gold. Jace's breath hitched. "Where?" he demanded, stepping closer. Did he get those eyes? The velvet-lined walls of the obsidian room seemed to swallow the ambient light, casting the entire restaurant in a perpetual, secretive dusk. It was an establishment where the city's elite and its most dangerous predators came to dine under the cover of exorbitant prices and ironclad discretion. For Madeline, it was simply the place that kept the lights on in her tiny, drafty apartment. She adjusted the crisp, starched apron around her waist, wincing as a sharp ache shot up from her heels. It was her 6th consecutive double shift, a brutal marathon of carrying heavy trays of Wagyu beef and vintage Bordeaux to men who wore suits that cost more than she made in a year. Madeline kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the intricate patterns of the Persian rugs beneath her feet. Survival in the obsidian room meant mastering the art of invisibility. You poured the wine, you cleared the plates, and you never, ever listened to the hushed, gravelly conversations taking place across the mahogany tables. You were a ghost with a tray, but being a ghost was exhausting, especially when she had a 4-month-old baby waiting for her at home, currently being watched by a kindly but increasingly impatient neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. Madeline's mind constantly calculated the terrifying math of her life. The cost of formula, the price of diapers, the impending rent, and the agonizingly low balance in her checking account. A sudden hush fell over the dining room, a thick, palpable silence that made the hair on the back of Madeline's neck stand up. The low hum of string instruments playing in the corner seemed to fade away. She didn't need to look up to know who had just walked through the brass-handled double doors. Jace. Just a first name, whispered with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror by the staff in the kitchens. He was the architect of the city's underground, a man whose reputation for cold, calculated violence was only matched by his immaculate, terrifying composure. Madeline stole a brief, cautious glance as she polished a wineglass behind the bar. Jace was a study in intimidating stillness. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator that knew it had no natural enemies. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling out a bespoke charcoal suit. His face could have been considered handsome if it weren't for the absolute void in his dark eyes. Eyes that scanned the room and seemed to categorize every patron as either an asset or a threat. He was flanked by 3 large men whose jackets bulged slightly at the sides. But Jace himself carried an aura that was far more dangerous than any concealed weapon. Madeline, the maitre de hist, suddenly appearing at her elbow, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "Table 4. Now. And for God's sake, don't drop anything." Table 4 was Jace's permanent reservation, a secluded, semicircular booth in the darkest corner of the restaurant. Madeline's stomach plummeted. She nodded silently, grabbing a fresh pitcher of iced water and a pristine white towel. Her hands were trembling slightly as she approached the booth. Jace was seated in the center, speaking in a voice so low it was practically a physical vibration rather than a sound. The men around him leaned in, hanging on his every syllable. As Madeline stepped into their periphery, she focused intensely on the mechanics of her job. Ice, water, steady pour, step back. She repeated the mantra in her head. She reached across the table, careful not to let her sleeve brush against Jace's suit. The air around him felt cold, charged with a heavy, oppressive energy. As she poured the water, a single drop of condensation ran down the outside of the heavy crystal pitcher and landed with a soft, barely audible plink on the pristine white tablecloth near his cuff. Madeline froze, her breath catching in her throat. One of Jace's men, a massive brute with a scarred jaw, immediately tensed, glaring at her. But Jace simply raised a hand, a fraction of an inch, and the man settled back. Jace slowly turned his head to look at her. It was the first time she had ever been in his direct line of sight. His gaze was terrifyingly blank, stripping away her humanity in an instant. To him, she was not a struggling mother, not a woman with hopes or dreams or fears. She was an errant drop of water. She was an inconvenience. "Apologies, sir," Madeline whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of her own heartbeat. She quickly dabbed the drop away with her towel and retreated, her legs feeling like lead. Back in the safety of the kitchen, she leaned against the cold stainless steel counter, closing her eyes and trying to regulate her breathing. She hated the fear that this place, and men like Jace, instilled in her. But the image of her baby boy, Leo, flashed in her mind. Leo, with his soft, peach fuzz hair, and the strange, beautiful eyes that she loved so fiercely. For Leo, she would endure the fear. She would endure the exhaustion. She would remain invisible. She checked her phone hidden in her apron pocket. A text from Mrs. Higgins. "He's fussy tonight, Maddie. Need you home soon." Madeline swallowed the lump in her throat, splashed some cold water on her face, and picked up her tray again. The night was far from over. And in the world of the obsidian room, shadows were always waiting to swallow you whole. She had to keep moving. She had to stay unseen. But as she walked back out onto the floor, she couldn't shake the chilling feeling that the predator in the corner booth had finally noticed the mouse scurrying across his floor. The Tuesday night shift started like any other, lulling Madeline into a false sense of security. The obsidian room was only half full, the clinking of silverware and the low murmur of wealthy patrons creating a sophisticated, hypnotic white noise. Madeline was balancing a massive, silver-plated tray laden with 3 plates of lobster thermidor, her arms straining under the immense weight as she navigated the narrow aisles between the velvet booths. She was exhausted, her mind drifting to the half-empty can of formula in her kitchen cabinet and the dread of knowing she needed to stretch it until Friday's payday. Table 4 was occupied, as always. Jace sat in his usual spot, though tonight his demeanor seemed tighter, the invisible coil around him wound to the breaking point. His men were constantly scanning the room, their hands resting uncomfortably close to their lapels. Madeline had learned to read the subtle shifts in the restaurant's atmosphere, and tonight, the air tasted like copper and impending thunder. Something was wrong. She was halfway across the main dining floor when the heavy brass doors at the front entrance were violently kicked open. The loud crack of wood hitting plaster severed the quiet ambiance like a guillotine. Madeline froze, the heavy tray trembling in her hands. 4 men spilled into the lobby, moving with an aggressive, jagged energy that violently clashed with the restaurant's refined elegance. They weren't dressed in the bespoke suits favored by Jace's syndicate. They wore dark, heavy leather and rough denim, their faces hardened by a different kind of street brutality. The maitre d' stepped forward, raising a hand in protest. But the lead man simply shoved him aside, sending the elegant older man crashing into a decorative floral arrangement. Panic rippled through the room. Chairs scraped loudly against the floorboards as patrons realized what was happening. Madeline stood paralyzed in the center of the aisle, caught completely in the open. "Jace!" the lead intruder roared, his voice rough and echoing through the grand room. He drew a heavy, matte black handgun from his waistband, pointing it directly toward the dark corner of table 4. "Time's up." Everything happened in a chaotic, terrifying blur. Before the intruder could even finish his sentence, the men surrounding Jace had already moved, flipping the heavy mahogany table onto its side to create a barricade. The sharp, deafening crack of gunfire erupted, instantly shattering the crystal chandelier hanging above the center of the room. A rain of glass and shadows descended. Women screamed. Men dove beneath tables. Madeline's survival instinct finally kicked in, but the heavy tray threw her off balance. As she tried to drop it and run, her foot caught on the edge of a Persian rug. She pitched forward, the tray crashing to the floor with a cacophonous clatter of shattering porcelain and scattering lobster shells. She hit the ground hard, her breath leaving her lungs in a violent rush. Her small, worn purse, which she secretly kept tucked in her apron pocket instead of the staff lockers out of fear of theft, flew out and spilled its contents across the polished wood floor. Lip balm, a ring of keys, a handful of coins, and a small, slightly crumpled photograph of Leo. More gunfire roared, the sound physically painful in the enclosed space. Wood splintered. Glasses exploded. Madeline scrambled on her hands and knees, desperately trying to gather her things, her mind hyper-fixated on the photograph of her baby. It was right in the middle of the aisle, exposed. Suddenly, a massive hand grabbed the back of her uniform collar, lifting her almost completely off the floor. She shrieked, thrashing wildly, but the grip was like iron. She was dragged backward, her knees scraping the floor, until she was forcefully thrown behind the thick, overturned oak bar. She landed in a heap, gasping for air, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. She looked up, expecting to see one of the leather-clad intruders about to execute her. Instead, she was looking at the immaculate, charcoal-suited knees of Jace. He was crouched beside her, a sleek silver weapon in his hand. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. While the world outside their wooden barricade descended into violent chaos, Jace was breathing slowly, his eyes scanning the edges of the bar. He fired twice, the sound deafening up close, and a heavy thud echoed from the other side of the room. Madeline curled into a tight ball, pressing her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. She was going to die here. She was going to die. And Leo would be left alone in that cold apartment with a neighbor who would eventually call the state. "Quiet," a voice commanded. It wasn't a yell. It was a low, firm order that cut straight through her panic. Jace was looking down at her. For the first time, the dark void of his eyes held a flicker of something else, an intense, sharp focus. He reached out with his free hand, the one not holding the gun, and opened his palm. Resting in the center of his large, calloused hand was the slightly crumpled photograph of Leo. He must have snatched it from the floor when he dragged her backward. Madeline gasped, lunging forward to snatch the photo from his grasp. She clutched it to her chest, rocking back and forth, her breathing jagged and hysterical. Jace stared at her for a long, heavy second. He looked at the desperate, fierce way she protected the cheap little photograph, the absolute terror in her eyes masking a deeply rooted maternal defiance. He didn't say a word. He simply turned his attention back to the dining room, his jaw set, and resumed dismantling the threat to his territory. But as the gunfire slowly died down, replaced by the groans of the injured and the distant wail of approaching sirens, Madeline knew that something fundamental had shifted. The invisible girl had been seen, and the ghost was now painfully, dangerously real. The obsidian room remained closed for 4 days, undergoing rapid, highly discreet renovations to scrub away the blood and patch the bullet holes in the mahogany paneling. When the doors finally reopened on a rainy Saturday evening, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Madeline returned because she had absolutely no choice. Rent was due in 2 days, and the meager emergency savings she had managed to hoard were completely depleted by Leo's sudden need for a specialized, hypoallergenic formula. She walked onto the floor feeling like she was stepping into a minefield. Every shadow seemed to conceal a weapon. Every loud clinking of a glass made her flinch. But the most terrifying change was not the lingering smell of fresh paint or the nervous energy of the staff. It was the way the dynamic had shifted with Table 4. Jace was there, of course. He returned to his corner booth as if the violent shootout had been nothing more than a minor disruption to his dinner schedule. But he was no longer ignoring her. Whenever Madeline was on the floor, she could feel the heavy, physical weight of his gaze following her. It wasn't the leering, predatory look she sometimes endured from the older, wealthy patrons. It was analytical, cold, searching. He requested her to serve his table exclusively. When she poured his wine, her hands shaking so badly the bottle rattled against the glass, he simply watched her wrists. When she cleared his plates, he studied the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. And when he left, the tip resting beneath his empty glass was always obscenely large. 3, sometimes 4 times her weekly paycheck in crisp $100 bills. Madeline was terrified. Did he think she was a liability? Did he think she had seen the faces of the rival gang members? The money felt like a trap. Blood money silently demanding her absolute compliance and silence. She wanted to quit, to run, but the crushing weight of poverty and her desperate need to provide for Leo anchored her to the velvet floors of the restaurant. 2 weeks into this grueling, silent psychological warfare, disaster struck on the home front. It was a freezing Thursday night. Madeline was already in her uniform, buttoning her stiff white collar, when her phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Higgins. "Maddie, dear, I'm so sorry. My sister fell and broke her hip. I have to go to the hospital right now. I can't watch the baby. I'm leaving him in his crib." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Madeline's veins. She couldn't afford to miss a shift. If she did, the manager, a ruthless man named Heir, would fire her on the spot. She had no family, no friends she could call at 6 in the evening. She looked at Leo, who was cooing softly from his worn-out crib, his little fists waving in the air. "Okay, baby," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Okay. We're gonna go on an adventure." She bundled Leo into his heavy winter snowsuit, strapped him into his bulky plastic car seat, and covered him completely with a thick, dark blanket. When she arrived at the restaurant, she bypassed the main entrance, slipping through the cold, rain-slicked alleyway and into the rear delivery door. She cornered Eris in the kitchen office, tears of sheer desperation threatening to spill over. She begged, she pleaded, offering to work for free, offering to do double cleanup duty, anything if he would just let her keep the car seat in the back break room for her shift. Eris looked at her with disgust, but the restaurant was severely understaffed that night. "Fine," he hissed, pointing a fat finger at her face, "but if I hear a single sound from that thing, or if anyone sees it, you're done. Clear out your locker and never come back." Madeline practically collapsed with relief. She hurried to the tiny, windowless break room at the very back of the kitchen maze. It smelled strongly of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and unwashed aprons. She set the car seat carefully in the corner, wedging it securely between a metal filing cabinet and the wall. Leo was asleep, lulled by the gentle rocking of her walk. She kissed his forehead, draped the blanket over the handle to shield his eyes from the harsh fluorescent light, and ran back out to the floor. The shift was a waking nightmare. The restaurant was packed, and Madeline was stretched to her absolute limit, balancing plates, memorizing complicated wine orders, and constantly stealing terrified glances toward the kitchen doors. Every 20 minutes, she would feign a bathroom break, sprint to the back room, and check on Leo. By 10 o'clock, the stress was causing a physical pain in her chest. Jace was at table 4, nursing a glass of scotch. Every time she passed his periphery, his dark eyes locked onto her. He noticed her frantic energy, her erratic movements, the way she kept disappearing into the back hallways. He wasn't a man who missed anomalies in his environment. Madeline felt like a hunted animal, the walls of the luxurious restaurant closing in around her. She just needed one more hour. Just one more hour until she could take her baby and disappear into the night. The low, rhythmic thrum of the kitchen exhaust fans masked the sound of Jace's footsteps as he walked down the narrow, tiled hallway. He had excused himself from his table, leaving his lieutenants mid-conversation, driven by an uncharacteristic itch of curiosity. He didn't like mysteries, especially not in places he controlled. And Madeline was becoming a mystery. For 2 weeks, he had watched the Waitress. He had studied her terror during the shootout, the fierce way she protected that cheap photograph. He had seen the dark bruises of exhaustion under her eyes and the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. He had given her enough money and tips to quit and disappear, yet she kept coming back, looking more hunted every single day. Tonight, her erratic behavior darting toward the rear of the building every few minutes, her eyes wide with a manic panic, bothered him. It was a liability. He needed to know if she was stealing, making drops for a rival, or hiding something that could compromise the safety of the obsidian room. He pushed past a swinging door, ignoring the startled gasp of a dishwasher, and approached the dingy, windowless break room at the end of the hall. He could hear a sound coming from inside. It was faint, muffled by the heavy door, but distinct, a soft, rhythmic whimpering. Jace placed his hand flat against the wood and pushed the door open. The harsh fluorescent light flickered above. The room was tiny, filled with the stench of old coffee. In the far corner, sitting on a turned-over milk crate, was Madeline. She had her back to the door, her apron unfastened. She was cradling a small bundle wrapped in a faded blue blanket, humming a low, desperate tune while gently swaying back and forth. Jace stepped fully into the room, his large frame blocking the doorway. The sudden change in air pressure, or perhaps just the sheer, terrifying weight of his presence, caused Madeline to freeze. She whipped her head around, her eyes widening in absolute, unfiltered horror. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely a breath. She instinctively curled her body around the baby, shielding him from Jace's view. "Please, Mr. Jace. Don't tell Eris. I couldn't get a sitter. I swear he hasn't made a sound all night. I'll be gone in 30 minutes. Please." Jace stared down at her. The great, ruthless Mafia boss felt a strange, uncomfortable tightness in his chest. This was what she was hiding. Not drugs, not a wire, not a weapon. A child. A liability, yes, but a pathetic, desperate one. He felt a flash of irritation. This was a place of business. Not a nursery, but the raw terror in her face stayed his anger. He took a slow step forward. "You brought an infant," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "to a place that was shot to pieces less than a month ago. I had no choice." Tears spilled over Madeline's eyelashes, leaving wet tracks through the light makeup she wore for work. "If I don't work, we don't eat. I'll leave right now. Just please don't let Eris fire me." Jace looked away in disgust, running a hand over his jaw. He should throw her out. He should have his men drag her out the back door and be done with the distraction. He turned back, preparing to tell her exactly that, when the bundle in her arms let out a loud, frustrated wail. Madeline shushed the baby frantically, shifting her hold to rock him against her chest. As she moved, the faded blue blanket fell away from the child's face. Jace looked down. The irritation vanished, replaced instantly by an icy, paralyzing shock. The baby had stopped crying, his attention caught by the towering figure standing above them. The child blinked, looking straight up at Jace. The world around Jace seemed to dissolve into a terrifying silence. The hum of the exhaust fans disappeared. The smell of the bleach faded away. All he could see were the baby's eyes. They were impossible. They were a striking, luminous silver, a color so pale it was almost translucent. But it wasn't just the color. Right around the pupil, bleeding outward into the silver, was a distinct, jagged starburst of bright metallic gold. It was a genetic anomaly, a specific, breathtaking flaw that Jace had only ever seen on one other human being in his entire life. His brother, Silas. Silas, who had been brutally murdered in a hit-and-run orchestrated by a rival family 18 months ago. Silas, the only person in the world Jace had ever truly loved. The soft heart of their dark family. Dead and buried in a closed casket. Jace's breath stopped completely in his lungs. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse carved from marble. His hands, usually so steady, so lethal, began to tremble uncontrollably at his sides. He took a stumbling half-step forward, his eyes locked onto the baby's face, tracing the shape of the brow, the curve of the small nose, the impossible, haunting eyes staring back at him with innocent curiosity. "Where?" Jace breathed, the sound tearing out of his throat, raw and broken, a terrifying departure from his usual cold composure. "Where did he get those eyes?" Madeline pulled Leo tighter, completely uncomprehending the monumental shift happening in front of her. I don't understand," she stammered, terrified by the sudden, intense volatility radiating from the dangerous man. Jace dropped to his knees, the expensive fabric of his suit pants hitting the dirty linoleum floor with a heavy thud. He didn't care. He leaned in close, his face inches from the child. The baby reached out a tiny, chubby hand, grabbing one of Jace's tailored lapels. Jace closed his eyes, a choked, agonizing sound escaping his lips. When he opened them again, the dark void was gone, replaced by a raging inferno of grief, revelation, and an incredibly dangerous, possessive fury. He looked up at Madeline, his expression feral. "Who is the father of this child?" The air in the tiny break room vanished. Madeline pressed herself so hard against the filing cabinet she felt the metal bite into her spine. The man kneeling before her was no longer the composed, untouchable crime lord who commanded Table 4. He was a tightly coiled spring, vibrating with a desperate, terrifying energy. His dark eyes were wide, manic, locked onto her face with an intensity that made her want to scream for help. "I asked you a question," Jace said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "Who is his father?" I don't see how that is any of your business," Madeline stammered, adrenaline overriding her fear for a brief, foolish second. Her maternal instinct flared, a protective shield rising to guard the only secret she had left. "Please, just let me leave." Jace moved faster than her eyes could track. His hand shot out, not touching her, but slamming into the metal cabinet inches from her head with a deafening crang. Madeline shrieked, squeezing her eyes shut and curling her body entirely over Leo, who began to cry loudly at the sudden noise. "Do not lie to me," Jace gritted out, his chest heaving. "Do not try to hide from me. Look at me." Madeline slowly opened her eyes, tears blurring her vision. "His name," Jace demanded. "Give me a name." "Evan," she sobbed, the truth tearing out of her under the unbearable pressure. His name was Evan. Okay? He's dead. He died before Leo was born. Just leave us alone. Jace rocked back on his heels, the name hitting him like a physical blow. Evan. A fake name. A coward's name. But it fit. Silas had always hated their family's legacy. He had always tried to slip away, to pretend he was someone else. Someone normal. Evan, Jace repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at Madeline, analyzing her features, trying to see what his brother had seen in this exhausted, fragile woman. He told you he was a musician, played the piano, said he made his money playing at high-end hotel bars. Madeline stopped crying abruptly, shock widening her eyes. How do you know that? Jace ignored her, the pieces of the puzzle aggressively locking into place in his mind. He had a small, crescent-shaped scar right here. Jace pointed to his own jawline, just below the ear. He laughed with his mouth closed, and when he was nervous, he would tap his thumb against his index finger. Like a metronome. Madeline's jaw dropped. The terrifying Mafia boss was perfectly describing the gentle, quiet man she had fallen in love with. The man who painted her tiny apartment walls, who cooked her cheap pasta dinners, who kissed her forehead and promised they would leave the city together. The man who was killed by a drunk driver in a hit-and-run on a rainy Tuesday night. Who are you? Madeline whispered, a new, much deeper dread pooling in her stomach. How do you know my Evan? Jace slowly stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. The feral energy began to recede, replaced by a cold, monolithic resolve that was somehow even more frightening. He looked down at the baby, who had quieted to a soft sniffle. Those impossible silver and gold eyes watching him. His name wasn't Evan, Jace said, his voice flat and dead. His name was Silas, and he was my younger brother. The room spun. Madeline gripped the edges of the car seat to keep from falling over. It couldn't be true. Her Evan, the sweet, sensitive artist who cried at sad movies, couldn't be related to this monster. He couldn't be part of the blood-soaked syndicate that terrorized the city. But the eyes. Jace was looking at Leo with a horrific certainty. He was killed, Jace continued, his voice devoid of any inflection, stating facts. It wasn't a drunk driver. It was a targeted hit by the Maroney family. They ran him down to send me a message. Madeline felt the bile rise in her throat. The narrative of her life, the tragic but simple story of her lost love, was being violently rewritten into a dark, terrifying Mafia saga. No, she gasped, shaking her head aggressively. No, you're lying. You're lying. Evan was Silas. Jace cut her off, the name cracking like a whip. My blood. Which means, he pointed a large, heavy finger at the baby in her arms. That child is my blood. He is a target. He has nothing to do with you, Madeline yelled, finding a reserve of ferocious courage she didn't know she possessed. She stood up, hauling the car seat up with her. He is my son. He is nobody's target, and he is certainly not part of your sick world. Now move out of my way. She tried to push past him toward the door. Jace didn't even flinch. He simply reached out and gripped her upper arm. It wasn't a painful hold, but it was an immovable one. He looked down at her, the void back in his eyes. But it was now swirling with a dark, terrifying possessiveness. The Maroneys know I have no weaknesses, Jace said softly, dangerously close to her ear. They killed my brother, thinking it would break me. It only made me worse. But if they find out that Silas left behind a son, an heir with the family eyes, they will not stop until they butcher him. And you, Madeline trembled, the fight draining out of her as the reality of his words sank in. You are no longer invisible, Madeline, Jace stated, finalizing her fate. Pack whatever you have in that locker. You're not going home tonight. You're coming with me. The drive out of the city was a silent, suffocating blur. Madeline sat in the back of the heavily armored SUV. Leo clutched tightly to her chest, surrounded by 3 of Jace's massive, stone-faced men. Jace sat in the front passenger seat, staring straight ahead into the darkness, a rigid silhouette against the passing streetlights. They hadn't allowed her to go back to her apartment. I will send a team to retrieve your belongings. Jace had dictated smoothly, as if ordering a side dish. Your current residence is no longer secure. An hour later, the SUV turned off the main highway. navigating through a dense, private forest road before pulling up to a massive set of wrought iron gates. They swung open silently, revealing a sprawling, fortress-like estate built of dark stone, bathed in harsh security lighting. It looked less like a home and more like a high-end prison. Madeline felt a cold dread settle deep into her bones. She was trapped. She had traded the crushing poverty of her tiny apartment for a gilded cage owned by a monster. They were escorted inside. The interior was cavernous, sterile, and impeccably clean. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and expensive modern art that looked cold and uninviting. There were no family photos, no signs of warmth or life. It was the lair of a man who existed solely to control his environment. Jace led her up a grand, sweeping staircase to the second floor, pushing open double doors to a massive suite. It was larger than her entire apartment building floor. A huge king-sized bed dominated the center, and a set of heavy oak doors led to an adjoining room. "This is your space," Jace said, not stepping past the threshold. He pointed to the adjoining doors. "My men converted the sitting room into a nursery. They acquired everything the child will need." Madeline stood in the center of the room, feeling incredibly small and entirely out of place in her stained waitress uniform. Clutching a cheap plastic car seat, she looked at Jace, her anger finally breaking through her terror. "You can't do this," she said, her voice shaking with quiet fury. "You can't just kidnap us. I have a life. I have rent to pay. I have life. You have a target on your back." Jace interrupted, his tone chillingly calm. "The moment I realized who that child was, the clock started ticking. My enemies have eyes everywhere. If they had found you first, you would be dead, and my nephew would be in a shallow grave to spite me." "He's not your nephew," Madeline screamed, the sound echoing harshly in the massive room. "He is my son. He is Evan's son." Jace's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck jumped. "Evan is dead," he said softly, the words laced with a sudden, raw pain that caught Madeline off guard. "Silas is dead, but this child is alive. And he carries my family's blood. I failed to protect my brother. I will not fail to protect his son. You will stay here. You will be provided for. You will not leave the grounds without my explicit permission and a full security detail." "I am a prisoner," Madeline whispered, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "You are alive," Jace countered coldly. He turned his back to her, grabbing the brass handle of the door. "There is food in the kitchen downstairs. A doctor will be here tomorrow to examine the child. Lock the door behind me." The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Madeline in utter silence. She collapsed onto the plush, expensive carpet, pulling Leo out of his car seat and burying her face in his soft, blanket-wrapped chest. She sobbed until she couldn't breathe, mourning the life she had known, mourning the beautiful, simple lie of Evan, and terrified of the dark, violent reality of Jace that had swallowed them whole. The next few weeks were a surreal, claustrophobic nightmare. Madeline felt like a ghost haunting a museum. She rarely saw Jace. He was a phantom who left the estate early in the morning in a convoy of black SUVs and returned late at night, smelling of cigar smoke and a cold, metallic tension. Her entire world shrank to the suite and the sprawling, walled gardens of the estate. She was watched constantly. Stoic men in dark suits stood at the end of the hallways and patrolled the perimeter. Yet, despite the terrifying circumstances, she couldn't deny the immediate, profound relief of her physical burdens. There were no bills to panic over. The massive refrigerator in the industrial kitchen was always fully stocked. The nursery adjoined to her room was filled with the highest quality crib, clothes, and an endless supply of the expensive formula Leo required. But it was hollow. It was survival, not living. One evening, nearly a month into her captivity, a violent thunderstorm rolled over the estate. Lightning cracked the sky, followed by thunder so loud it shook the heavy windows. Leo, usually a good sleeper, woke up screaming, terrified by the noise. Madeline, exhausted from a day of anxious pacing, stumbled into the nursery, trying to soothe him. But Leo was inconsolable. He arched his back, crying so hard his little face turned purple. Madeline rocked him, shushed him, sang to him, but nothing worked. The thunder kept crashing, reigniting his panic. She walked out into the hallway, desperate for a change of scenery to calm him, pacing the long, shadowed corridor. She didn't realize she had wandered toward the east wing Jace's private quarters. Suddenly, a door opened. Jace stepped out into the hall. He was out of his suit, wearing only dark slacks and a crisp white undershirt. He looked exhausted, rubbing his temples, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He stopped when he saw her. Madeline froze, her heart hammering. "I'm sorry," she gasped over Leo's wails. "I didn't mean to come this way. The thunder, he won't stop crying. I'll go back." She turned to retreat, but Jace spoke. "Wait." He walked toward her slowly, his massive frame intimidating in the dim hallway. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at the screaming infant. The dark void in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, uncertain hesitation. "Give him to me," Jace said softly. Madeline tightened her grip instinctively. "No. He's fine. I just need to—" "Madeline," Jace said, his voice stripping away the authority of the boss and revealing something terrifyingly vulnerable beneath. "Let me try." Hesitantly, her arms trembling, Madeline slowly extended the crying bundle toward the towering man. Jace set his glass down on a nearby console table with agonizing slowness, as if approaching a volatile explosive. He reached out, his large, lethal hands awkwardly sliding beneath Leo's back and head. As Jace pulled the baby against his broad chest, he looked entirely out of his element, a wolf trying to hold a butterfly without crushing it. But as soon as Leo was settled against the solid, warm expanse of Jace's chest, the baby's frantic wailing began to stutter. Jace started a slow, rhythmic sway, a slightly stiff but deliberate rocking motion. He raised one large hand, the fingers scarred from years of violence, and gently, almost reverently, cupped the back of Leo's tiny head. "Shh," Jace rumbled, his voice a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to travel directly from his chest into the child. "Quiet now. The storm is outside. It cannot reach you here." Madeline stood completely still, her breath caught in her throat. The transformation was startling. The ruthless, terrifying crime boss had vanished, replaced by a man holding the last fragile piece of his shattered heart. Leo hiccuped, his cries reducing to soft, exhausted whimpers. He turned his head, resting his wet cheek against Jace's white undershirt, and slowly opened his eyes. The silver and gold irises caught the dim light of the hallway. Jace stared down into them, his own dark eyes shining with an unshed, agonizing grief. He has Silas's chin, too," Jace whispered, his voice cracking, thick with a vulnerability Madeline had never thought him capable of. "The way it sets when he's angry. Silas used to do that when we were boys." Madeline took a cautious step closer. The fear that had defined her relationship with this man began to fracture, revealing a shared, profound sorrow. "Evan, Silas," she corrected herself softly. "He told me he got his chin from his mother." Jace let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sob. "He did. She died when we were young. It was just the two of us for a long time. I was supposed to protect him." He looked up at Madeline, his expression stripped bare. "I built this empire to ensure no one could ever touch us. And the higher I climbed, the more he hated me for it. He ran from the blood on my hands. He ran, and he hid with you. And because he had no protection, they slaughtered him in the street." The raw agony in his voice shattered Madeline's remaining defenses. She saw him not as her captor, but as a man drowning in a guilt so deep it defined his entire existence. "He loved you," Madeline said quietly, the truth settling over her. "He never told me who you were, but he told me about his older brother. He told me you were strong. He told me he missed you." Jace closed his eyes tightly, a single tear escaping and tracking down his rough cheek. He pressed his lips to the top of Leo's head, inhaling the scent of baby powder and rain. He stood there for a long time, rocking his sleeping nephew, finding a peace in the quiet hallway that he hadn't felt in years. From that night on, the invisible walls in the estate began to crumble. Jace began seeking them out. He would return from the city earlier. He would sit in the nursery while Madeline fed Leo, reading quiet reports, simply sharing the space. The oppressive silence of the mansion was slowly replaced by the gentle, chaotic sounds of a baby growing. Madeline noticed changes in Jace. The tight coil of violent tension he constantly carried began to loosen. He would smile, a small, rare thing, when Leo grabbed his finger. He started asking Madeline questions, not interrogations, but genuine inquiries about her life, her dreams, the things Silas had said and done when they were together. She, in turn, began to see the man behind the monster. She saw his sharp intellect, his dry, dark humor, and the fierce, absolute loyalty he possessed. He wasn't holding her prisoner out of malice. He was holding her out of a desperate, terrified need to protect the only family he had left. One afternoon, sitting in the sunlit garden while Leo napped in his stroller, Jace looked at her over his coffee. "I am dismantling the Southern Territory," he said abruptly, his tone casual but the words carrying massive weight. Madeline frowned, confused by the Mafia politics. "What does that mean?" "It means," Jace said, looking out over the rolling lawns, "I am cutting ties with the most violent factions of my syndicate. I am moving assets into legitimate holdings, real estate, shipping, clean money." He turned his dark eyes back to her, and they were clear and resolute. "I will not let this child grow up in the shadows of my sins. I will not let him inherit a war." Madeline felt a flutter in her chest, a profound sense of awe. He was tearing down the empire he had built with blood, piece by piece, all for the silver-eyed baby sleeping next to them. "That sounds dangerous," she said softly. "Your enemies. Let them come," Jace said, his voice dropping to that lethal whisper she remembered from the restaurant. But this time, it was a shield, not a weapon. "I will burn this city to ash before I let anyone touch either of you." He reached out across the small wrought iron table and gently covered her hand with his. It was the first time he had ever touched her with anything other than forceful necessity. His palm was warm, rough, and incredibly grounding. Madeline didn't pull away. She looked down at their connected hands, realizing with a terrifying clarity that she no longer wanted to leave. The gilded cage had become a fortress, and the monster had become their protector. But in Jace's world, peace was an illusion, and the ghosts of the past rarely stayed buried for long. The transition from shadow to legitimacy was not a peaceful one. By liquidating his illegal territories, Jace showed a perceived weakness, a fatal flaw in the ecosystem of the underworld. The Maroney family, the same ruthless syndicate that had murdered Silas, sensed blood in the water. They didn't know why the invincible Jace was suddenly retreating, but they knew it was an opportunity to strike the king and take the throne. It happened on a Tuesday, ironically, the exact day of the week Silas had been killed. Madeline and Jace were in the main living room. The large, heavy drapes were pulled back, allowing the afternoon sun to pour across the Persian rugs. Madeline was sitting on the floor, laughing as Leo clumsily attempted to crawl toward a brightly colored wooden block. Jace was sitting on the leather sofa, reviewing a stack of legal documents, but his eyes constantly drifted over the rim of his glasses to watch them. The atmosphere was warm, domestic, and terrifyingly fragile. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the living room burst open. Marcus, Jace's second-in-command, stood in the doorway, bleeding heavily from a deep gash on his forehead, his suit torn. He was breathing raggedly, a submachine gun gripped tightly in his hands. "Boss," Marcus gasped, his eyes wide with adrenaline. "Perimeter is breached. It's the Maronis. They brought a small army. They've cut the hard lines and jammed the cell signals. We are completely boxed in." The domestic warmth evaporated instantly, replaced by the freezing metallic taste of war. Jace moved with terrifying speed. He dropped the papers, sweeping his hand under the sofa cushion and pulling out a heavy handgun. The soft, watching uncle vanished, and the apex predator of the city returned. "How many?" Jace barked, his voice devoid of panic, operating on pure, lethal, tactical instinct. 24 at least. "Heavy weapons. They're pushing through the West Wing," Marcus reported, wincing as he wiped blood from his eyes. Jace turned to Madeline. She was frozen on the floor, clutching Leo tightly to her chest, her eyes wide with the same horrific terror she had felt in the restaurant months ago. "Get up," Jace commanded, crossing the room in 2 massive strides. He grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet. "Safe room, now." He dragged her out of the living room and down the main corridor. The sprawling estate had suddenly become a war zone. The distant, staccato pop-pop-pop of automatic gunfire echoed through the high-vaulted ceilings. Shouts and the sound of shattering glass filled the air. Jace pushed her toward the heavy mahogany panels of his private study. He pressed his hand against a hidden biometric scanner disguised as a wood carving. A loud clunk echoed behind the wall, and the heavy bookshelf swung open, revealing a reinforced steel door. "Get inside," Jace ordered, shoving her gently into the small, windowless concrete bunker. It was stocked with water, medical supplies, and monitors displaying the estate's security cameras. Madeline spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt physically sick. Jace was standing in the doorway, the darkness of the hallway framing him. He wasn't stepping inside. "Jace, no," she gasped, reaching out with her free hand to grab his shirt. "You have to come in, please." Jace looked down at her, then down at the baby shivering in her arms. He reached out, his bloody, calloused hand gently cupping Madeline's cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear she didn't realize she had shed. "They are here to finish what they started with, Silas," Jace said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble of absolute violence. "If I hide in here, they will lay siege until we starve. I have to end this. I have to sever the head of the snake, or you and Leo will never be safe. You'll die," she sobbed, clinging to his shirt. The thought of losing him, the thought of this massive, broken, protective man bleeding out on the marble floors, was a sudden, agonizing terror. She had lost Evan. She could not lose Jace. "I am not going to die," Jace stated, his dark eyes burning with an inferno of possessive rage. "I have something to live for now. Lock the door, Madeline. Do not open it for anyone but me." He pulled away from her grasp. The heavy steel door slid shut with a massive, final thud, plunging the bunker into the cool glow of the security monitors. Madeline collapsed into the corner, rocking Leo, her eyes glued to the screens. She watched in horrific, silent anxiety as the battle for her new family unfolded. She saw Jace moving through the hallways like a shadow, a lethal, precise instrument of destruction. He didn't fight with wild abandon. He fought with cold, calculated fury. He was protecting his blood. He was protecting his home. The siege lasted for 40 agonizing minutes. Madeline watched men fall, watched the beautiful estate get torn apart by bullets. Finally, on the main foyer camera, she saw Jace corner the leader of the Moroni assault. There was no grand speech, no dramatic pause. Jace simply raised his weapon and ended the threat to his family with absolute finality. But as the man fell, Madeline saw Jace stumble. He leaned heavily against a marble pillar, clutching his side, his crisp white shirt rapidly staining with dark, spreading crimson. He slid down the pillar to the floor, his head dropping forward. "No!" Madeline screamed into the silence of the bunker. She didn't hesitate. She placed Leo securely in the padded armchair, hit the emergency release on the steel door, and ran out into the smoke-filled, blood-soaked hallways of the estate. The air in the foyer was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and dust. Madeline scrambled over debris, her breathing jagged and frantic, until she reached the marble pillar. Jace was sitting on the floor, pale and breathing shallowly, his hand pressing hard against a gunshot wound in his lower abdomen. He looked up as she dropped to her knees beside him. Despite the pain, a flash of severe anger crossed his face. "I told you to stay." In the room, he grunted, wincing as he spoke. "Shut up!" Madeline snapped, a fierce, commanding edge in her voice that shocked them both. She tore the fabric of her cardigan, wadding it up and pressing it brutally hard against his wound. Jace let out a sharp hiss of pain, his head falling back against the marble. "You don't get to die. You promised me you wouldn't die." "I'm not dying," Jace breathed, his dark eyes focusing on her face, watching her desperate, blood-stained hands working to save him. The fierce, stubborn set of her jaw reminded him of the woman who had protected a tiny photograph in the middle of a shootout. She was magnificent. She was the strongest thing he had ever known. Paramedics and Jace's remaining loyal men flooded the estate minutes later. The next few hours were a blur of screaming sirens, sterile hospital lights, and agonizing waiting. Madeline sat in the private waiting room of the underground clinic Jace controlled, clutching Leo, her clothes ruined with Jace's blood. She refused to leave, threatening Eris, who had somehow appeared to manage the situation, that she would scream to the police if they tried to move her. Finally, the private surgeon emerged, looking exhausted but calm. "He'll live," the doctor said, wiping his hands. "The bullet missed his vital organs. He's tough as nails. He's awake and demanding to see you." Madeline pushed past the doctor, hurrying into the sterile recovery room. Jace was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to an IV, his torso heavily bandaged. He looked drained, the terrifying aura of the Mafia boss subdued by heavy painkillers, leaving only the man behind. He turned his head as she entered. His eyes immediately went to the bundle in her arms, ensuring Leo was safe. Before locking onto Madeline, she walked to the edge of the bed, her legs trembling. She didn't say a word. She simply reached down and gently placed her free hand over his large, pale one resting on the sheets. Jace turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. His grip was weak, but the emotional anchor was absolute. "The Maronis are done," Jace said, his voice a raspy whisper. "With their leadership gone, the remaining factions will scatter. The legitimate transition is complete, the violent part of my life. It died on that floor today." Madeline squeezed his hand, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "You're sure?" "I am sure," Jace said, his thumb weakly brushing against her knuckles. He looked at Leo, who was sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the war that had been fought for him. "Silas gave me a second chance. He gave me a family to protect, not an empire to rule. I won't waste it." Jace looked back up at Madeline. The dark void in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, unwavering warmth and a quiet, profound devotion. "If you still want to leave," he whispered, the vulnerability terrifying for a man like him, "when I am healed, I will buy you a house anywhere in the world. I will provide for you both forever. You won't ever have to see me again." Madeline looked at the scarred, dangerous man who had kidnapped her, terrified her, and ultimately bled for her. She thought of the cold, lonely apartment, and she thought of the way Leo stopped crying the moment he was placed against Jace's chest. She thought of the way Jace looked at her, not as an invisible waitress, but as the center of his new world. She leaned down, gently resting her forehead against his shoulder, careful of his bandages. "We're not going anywhere," Madeline whispered, closing her eyes as Jace let out a long, shaky breath of relief and pulled her closer. "We are exactly where we belong." The dark legacy of the family had ended in blood, but from its ashes, under the watchful, silver and gold eyes of a child, a new legacy had begun, not built on fear, but on the fierce, unyielding foundation of love. True redemption is rarely found in grand, sweeping gestures. Often, it hides in the smallest, most fragile moments, like the silver and gold eyes of an innocent child staring into the dark void of a broken man. Jace and Madeline's journey from fear and survival to fierce, protective love reminds us that even in the darkest corners of the world, family is not just about blood. It is about the deliberate, courageous choice to step out of the shadows, protect the vulnerable, and build a sanctuary of love where there was once only war. If this story of unexpected love, dangerous secrets, and ultimate redemption moved you, please leave a like, share this story with someone who loves a dramatic twist, and subscribe for more intensely emotional, cinematic tales.